The boy with the radio. The autumn wind swept across the airfield at Jitterbog Dam, carrying with it the acrid smell of aviation fuel and burnt rubber. 12-year-old Klaus Schneider sat perched on an overturned fuel drum, his knees pulled to his chest, watching the Messerschmitt Bf 109's taxi across the concrete. His father, Hauptmann Ernst Schneider, commanded the fighter squadron, and Klaus had spent every moment he could at the base since his mother's death in a bombing raid 6 months earlier. Klaus was different from other boys his age. While they played soldiers in the streets of Berlin, he studied radio frequencies and aircraft recognition with an intensity that worried the base physician. His notebook, covered in oil stains and filled with meticulous drawings, contained detailed sketches of every Allied bomber type. The angular Lancaster, the distinctive B-17 Flying Fortress, the sleek Mosquito. He knew their profiles, their engine sounds, their typical attack formations. The squadron had been bleeding pilots at an alarming rate. The Allied bombing campaigns were relentless, and the Luftwaffe's warning systems were increasingly inadequate. By the time the radar stations detected incoming bombers and relayed the information through proper channels, precious minutes were lost. Minutes that often meant the difference between a successful intercept and a devastating raid on German cities or industrial targets. Klaus had noticed a pattern. Using his father's old radio receiver, which he'd repaired and modified with parts scavenged from damaged aircraft, he discovered that Allied bombers often transmitted brief radio checks as they crossed the channel. These transmissions, though encrypted, created distinctive interference patterns that Klaus learned to recognize. More importantly, he noticed that certain frequencies would crackle with activity 15 to 20 minutes before the official warnings reached the airfield. One evening, as Oberleutnant Heinrich Weber, a pilot Klaus had grown close to, prepared for a night sortie, the boy approached him with trembling hands clutching his notebook. "Herr Oberleutnant," Klaus said, "I think I can give you more warning time." Weber, a veteran of the Battle of Britain with a scarred face and kind eyes, knelt to the boy's level. "What do you mean, Klaus?" The boy explained his observations, the patterns he'd documented, the correlation between the radio interference and bomber streams. Weber listened intently, his scarred face thoughtful. Most adults would have dismissed a child's theories, but Weber had learned during his years of combat that survival often came from unexpected sources. "Show me," Weber said. That night, Klaus sat in the operations room with his modified radio, headphones pressed to his ears, while Weber stood beside him. At 2,147 hours, Klaus suddenly straightened. "They're coming," he whispered. "Heavy bombers, probably 30 or more, bearing approximately northwest." Weber glanced at the clock and the empty situation board. The official warning system showed nothing. He made a decision that would change everything. "Sound the alarm." He ordered the operations officer, who hesitated, looking at the child, then at Weber's iron cross, then finally complied. The pilots of JG-52 scrambled to their aircraft. 16 Bf-109 Gustav models roared into the night sky, their DB-605 engines screaming. 12 minutes later, the official warning arrived. A large formation of British Lancaster bombers heading toward the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. Because of Klaus's early warning, Weber's fighters were already at altitude, positioned perfectly for an intercept. The squadron fell upon the bomber stream like wolves, their 20mm cannons tearing through the night. 5 Lancasters fell, and the formation scattered, dropping their payloads harmlessly in open fields. Not a single German fighter was lost. When the pilots returned, exhausted and exhilarated, they found Klaus asleep in the operations room, his head on his notebook, the radio still humming beside him. Weber gently lifted the boy and carried him to his father's quarters. Hauptmann Schneider arrived moments later, his face a mixture of pride and concern. "Heinrich tells me my son performed a miracle tonight." "Not a miracle, Ernst," Weber replied, laying Klaus on the cot. "Science, intelligence, and the courage to speak up when it mattered." He paused, looking at the sleeping boy. "He may have saved all our lives tonight." The squadron commander looked at his son, then at Weber. "Then we need to make this official. If this works, if he can really give us those extra minutes." He didn't finish the sentence, but both men understood. In a war where Germany was increasingly desperate, even the unconventional ideas of a 12-year-old boy deserved consideration. Klaus's system was about to be put to the ultimate test. The system takes shape. The morning after Klaus's first successful warning, Hauptmann Schneider convened an emergency meeting in the operations room. Present were Weber, the squadron's technical officer Lieutenant Kaufmann, and the base intelligence officer Major Dietrich, a skeptical Prussian who viewed anything unconventional with deep suspicion. "Gentlemen," Schneider began, "last night we achieved a perfect intercept based on information provided by a 12-year-old boy with a salvage radio. Before you dismiss this, I want you to hear the details." Klaus stood before these battle-hardened officers, his hands shaking slightly as he opened his notebook. He explained his methodology with surprising precision, how he'd mapped frequencies against confirmed bomber formations over 3 months, how certain patterns of static and interference preceded raids by predictable intervals, how he could distinguish between different Allied air groups by their radio discipline and transmission characteristics. Major Dietrich leaned forward, his iron cross glinting in the harsh overhead light. "This is absurd. You're telling me this child has somehow developed a more effective early warning system than our entire radar network." "Not more effective, sir," Klaus said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just faster. The radar sees them, but the information has to go through channels. I hear them talking to each other as they form up over England." Lieutenant Kaufmann, the technical officer, studied Klaus's notes with growing fascination. "He's documented over 40 raids here. The correlations are remarkable." He looked up at Dietrich. "Sir, the boy might be onto something. If Allied bombers maintain radio communication during their approach, which we know they do, and if he's learned to recognize the signatures." "It's unorthodox," Dietrich admitted, "but these are unorthodox times." He fixed Klaus with a stern gaze. "Can you do this reliably?" "Every time." Klaus hesitated, which actually strengthened his credibility. "Not every time, sir. Sometimes the atmospherics interfere. Sometimes they maintain radio silence until later. But I think I can give warning maybe 7 times out of 10. And I'm getting better." Weber spoke up. 7 times out of 10 is 7 times we don't get caught on the ground. 7 times we're at altitude instead of climbing desperately. 7 times more of us come home." Schneider made his decision. "We implement this immediately. Klaus, you'll work in shifts with the regular radio operators. Lieutenant Kaufmann, you'll help him improve his equipment and document his procedures so others can learn. Major Dietrich, you'll report this to headquarters, but for now, we operate under my authority as squadron commander." What they needed was a signal system, a way to quickly communicate Klaus's warnings to the pilots. The standard alert procedures were too slow, too formal. By the time orders were processed and transmitted, the advantage would be lost. Klaus had an idea. The pilots could wear colored armbands, he suggested. "I could hold up different colored flags visible from the dispersal area. Red for immediate threat, yellow for possible threat in 30 minutes, green for all clear." Weber laughed. "The traffic light system. I like it, but what about night operations?" "Lights," Kaufmann interjected. "We could rig a simple signal tower with colored lamps. Klaus sits in the tower with his radio, and he controls the lights directly. The pilots see the signals from anywhere on the field." Over the next 3 days, the ground crew constructed what they jokingly called Klaus's lighthouse, a 15-meter tower with powerful red, yellow, and green lamps visible from across the airfield. Klaus's radio setup was moved to the top, giving him an unobstructed view of the field and the skies beyond. The other pilots were divided. Some, like Weber, embraced the system enthusiastically. Others grumbled about taking orders from child. Feldwebel Koch, a veteran with 30 kills, was particularly vocal in his skepticism. "This is what we've come to," Koch complained in the mess hall. "Trusting our lives to a boy playing with a radio?" Weber fixed him with a cold stare. "Would you prefer to trust the system that got 6 of our pilots killed last week because we were caught on the ground?" The test came sooner than expected. On Klaus's 4th day in the tower, during the afternoon of October 18th, 1943, he detected the familiar patterns. The interference was strong, the frequency burst distinctive. He'd learned to interpret not just the presence of bombers, but their approximate numbers and trajectories based on the intensity and spread of the signals. His hand reached for the light controls. The yellow lamp blazed alive. Possible threat, 30 minutes. On the field below, pilots looked up at the tower. Some moved toward their aircraft. Others waited for official confirmation. Schneider watched from the operations room, his stomach tight with tension. If Klaus was wrong, his credibility would be destroyed. If he was right, but they didn't react. 20 minutes later, Klaus switched from yellow to red. Immediate threat. Schneider ordered the scramble. Engines roared to life across the field. Feldwebel-Koch ran to his Bf 109, still muttering complaints, but following orders nonetheless. The fighters were at 8,000 meters when the official warning arrived. American B-17s, 70-plus aircraft, heading toward the Schweinfurt ball-bearing factories again. The Luftwaffe called it Black Thursday, and it would become one of the war's most savage air battles. Thanks to Klaus's early warning, JG-52 had position and altitude. They dove into the bomber formation with devastating effect. Black Thursday, the sky above Schweinfurt transformed into a hell of fire and metal. Klaus watched from his tower through binoculars, his heart pounding as the tiny silhouettes of Bf 109s tore into the massive American bomber formation. Even at this distance, he could see the tracers arcing through the October sky, the black puffs of flak, and the occasional flash that meant an aircraft had exploded. Weber's fighter carved through the bomber stream with practiced precision. His first burst caught 8 B-17 in the number 3 engine, which immediately erupted in flames. The bomber fell away, trailing smoke, as Weber rolled to avoid return fire from the defensive gunners. The American .50 caliber machine guns were formidable. He'd seen them shred Bf 109s like paper. Blue leader, break right. The radio crackled with urgent warnings. Weber threw his aircraft into a violent turn, narrowly avoiding collision with a falling bomber. The sky was chaos, filled with aircraft, parachutes, debris, and death. On the ground, Klaus monitored multiple frequencies, his modified radio allowing him to hear both German and Allied transmissions. He could hear the American pilots calling for help, reporting damage, coordinating their defense. One voice, young and frightened, kept repeating, "We're losing hydraulics, we're losing hydraulics." Then silence. The battle lasted 37 minutes. When the surviving bombers limped away toward England, trailing smoke and missing aircraft from their formations, JG-52 began returning to base. Klaus counted them as they appeared on the horizon. 1, 2, 3. His throat tightened. 12 had taken off. 12 needed to return. 7, 8, 9. The count slowed. 10, 11. Klaus gripped the tower railing, his knuckles white. Where was the 12th? Then he saw it. A Bf 109 trailing smoke, flying low and unsteady. Klaus grabbed the radio handset. "Tower to damaged aircraft. Identify yourself." "This is Koch." The voice was strained, pained. "I've taken hits to the engine and fuselage. I don't know if I can make the field." Klaus's mind raced. He'd studied emergency procedures obsessively, part of his need to understand every aspect of aerial warfare. "Feldwebel-Koch, what's your altitude and distance?" 300 meters, maybe 8 kilometers out. A pause, then a groan. "I'm losing pressure in hydraulics. Controls are getting heavy." Klaus made a decision. He switched the lights to green, all clear, then added rapid flashing, their improvised distress signal. Below, the emergency crews scrambled to the runway. Fire trucks and ambulances moved into position. "Sir," Klaus said into the radio, his voice steadier than he felt, "you need to maintain current altitude. Don't try to climb. Keep your speed steady. You can glide in if the engine fails." "Who is this?" Koch's voice was suspicious even in crisis. "It's Klaus, sir. I'm guiding you in." A bitter laugh crackled through static. "The boy? My life is in the hands of child." "Right now, sir, yes." Klaus watched the struggling aircraft through binoculars, calculating angles and distance. "You're 5 kilometers out. The wind is from the west at 10 kilometers per hour. You want to approach from the east side to compensate. Hauptmann Schneider burst into the tower room, having run up the stairs. Klaus, what are you doing? Helping bring Coke home, father. Schneider started to object, then stopped. His son was already committed. Interference now could cost Coke his life. Continue, he said simply, moving to stand beside Klaus. The damaged Bf-109 struggled closer. Black smoke poured from its engine, and Klaus could see bullet holes stitching the fuselage. 3 kilometers, Klaus reported. You're doing well, sir. Maintain heading. Engine temperature is critical, Coke reported. I'm going to lose it. Then shut it down now, sir, while you still have altitude. Glide in. There was a moment of hesitation. Shutting down the engine was committing to the landing. There would be no going around, no second chance. Coke made his choice. The black smoke stopped as the engine ceased. The aircraft became a glider, silent and vulnerable. Klaus talked him in, his voice calm despite the terror he felt. 2 kilometers. You're lined up perfectly. Extend landing gear. He paused, seeing the gear deploy. 1 kilometer. You're a little high. Drop your nose slightly. Compensate for the crosswind. Ease left. Below, every member of the squadron stood watching. Weber had his hands clenched into fists. Other pilots whispered prayers or lucky phrases. 500 meters. You're perfect, sir. Just hold it steady. Coke's Bf-109 cleared the fence, its propeller motionless, moving in eerie silence. The wheels touched concrete with a squeal of rubber. The aircraft bounced once, settled, and rolled down the runway, gradually slowing. When it finally stopped, Klaus released the breath he'd been holding. His legs felt like water. His father's hand gripped his shoulder, firm and proud. The canopy opened, and Coke climbed out with difficulty, his flight suit dark with blood from a shoulder wound. He looked up at the tower, found Klaus's figure in the window, and offered a slow, respectful salute. That evening, as the squadron gathered in the mess for their post-mission briefing, the mood was subdued despite the day's success. They destroyed 12 American bombers confirmed, possibly more. But the cost had been visible. Coke's aircraft was a write-off. 2 other Bf-109s needed extensive repairs. And across Germany, other squadrons hadn't been as fortunate. Major Dietrich arrived with news from headquarters. The battle had been catastrophic for the Americans. 60 bombers lost, more than 600 men dead or captured. But it had also been costly for the Luftwaffe. 38 German fighters destroyed, their irreplaceable pilots dead. Because of our early warning, Dietrich said, looking at Klaus, we had no losses today. 0. Headquarters wants to know more about this. Klaus system, they're calling it. Klaus felt all eyes turned toward him. He shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very aware that he was a child among warriors. Weber spoke up. The boy gave us 15 extra minutes. We used those minutes to climb to altitude and position ourselves advantageously. That's why we came home. Feldwebel Koch stood, his arm in a sling, his face pale but determined. All my life to that boy. Twice today, once for the warning that got us airborne with time to spare, and once for talking me down when my aircraft was crippled. He raised his glass. To Klaus. The room echoed to Klaus. The word spreads. News of Klaus's system spread through the Luftwaffe Fighter Command with remarkable speed. In a military organization increasingly desperate for any advantage against the overwhelming Allied air forces, the story of a boy with a modified radio who could predict bomber raids captured imaginations and generated intense interest. Within a week of Black Thursday, JG-52's success rate became impossible to ignore. While neighboring squadrons suffered mounting losses, Schneider's unit maintained an almost perfect scramble rate. They were airborne with altitude advantage for 9 out of 12 raids, an unprecedented success that led to increased bomber losses and, more importantly, decreased German fighter casualties. General Adolf Galland, the General der Jagdflieger, General of Fighter Pilots, arrived at Jüterbog Dam unannounced on a cold November morning. His presence caused immediate tension. Galland was a living legend, holder of a Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds, credited with over 90 confirmed kills. He was also known for his brutal honesty and disdain for bureaucratic nonsense. Klaus was in his tower when he saw the staff car arrive. His stomach knotted when he recognized Gallen's distinctive profile. The general still wore his dress uniform with his medals rather than standard flight gear, a famous eccentricity that had nearly gotten him court-martialed multiple times. Hauptmann Schneider met Galland on the tarmac. "Herr General, this is unexpected. Skip the formalities." "Ernst," Galland interrupted, lighting one of his trademark cigars. "I'm here to see this miracle boy." "Where is he?" Schneider pointed to the tower. Galland squinted upward, then started walking. "Join me, and bring Weber. I want unvarnished truth, not propaganda." In the tower, Klaus stood at attention, his heart hammering. Galland entered, glanced around at the crude but functional setup, then fixed Klaus with a penetrating stare. "Sit," he ordered. "You look like you might faint, and I need you conscious." Klaus sat. Galland pulled up a chair, backwards, and straddled it, his arms crossed on the backrest. "You're Klaus Schneider, 12 years old. Your mother died in a bombing raid. You taught yourself radio mechanics and aircraft recognition. You've developed a system that's giving this Squadron 15 to 20 minutes advance warning on bomber raids. Do I have that right?" "Yes, Herr General. Show me how it works." For the next hour, Klaus demonstrated his system. He explained frequency patterns, atmospheric interference, the distinctive characteristics of different Allied bomber groups. He showed his notebooks filled with meticulous observations. He described how he'd learned to estimate force size and approach vectors based on radio traffic patterns. Galland listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes. When Klaus finished, the general turned to Weber. "You've flown with this information. Your assessment." "The boy is never entirely certain, sir," Weber said carefully. He rates his own predictions: high confidence, medium confidence, low confidence. When he says high confidence, he's been correct every time. Medium confidence, he's right about 70% of the time. He never calls a scramble on low confidence. He just advises us to be ready. Losses since implementing this system: 1 aircraft damaged beyond repair, 2 pilots wounded. No deaths. Galland's eyebrows rose. In 6 weeks of operations? While other squadrons in this sector have lost 40% of their strength. He turned back to Klaus. "Can this system be replicated? Can you teach others?" Klaus hesitated. "I think so, sir. But it takes time to learn the patterns. And you need the right equipment. Commercial radios don't work as well. I modified mine with parts from damaged aircraft." "What do you need?" The question caught Klaus off guard. "Sir, what do you need to make this system work better? To teach others? What resources would help?" Klaus's mind raced. He'd been operating on salvaged parts and improvisation, never imagining he might have actual support. "Better receivers, sir. Multiple frequency capability. Maybe 3 receivers that I could monitor simultaneously. And if I could coordinate with other observers at different locations, we could triangulate approach vectors more accurately." Galland stood, stubbing out his cigar. "You'll have it. I'm assigning Lieutenant Kaufmann as your technical officer. He'll report directly to my headquarters with your requirements." He paused, looking at the boy with an expression Klaus couldn't quite read. "The Americans will figure out what we're doing eventually. They'll change their procedures, maintain radio silence, use different frequencies. This advantage won't last forever." "I know, sir. But for now, you're saving German lives. That matters." Galland moved to the tower window, looking out at the airfield. "I'm authorizing the establishment of listening posts at 5 locations around this sector. You'll train the operators. Each post will have a modified receiver design. We'll create a network." Schneider cleared his throat. "Herr General, Klaus is 12 years old. He can't travel to multiple bases, train adults. Then he'll do it from here via telephone conference. We'll bring the trainees here. We'll do whatever it takes." Galland turned, his face grave. "Gentlemen, we're losing this war. I won't lie to you. The enemy has more planes, more pilots, more of everything. But we can still make them pay for every meter of German sky. We can still protect our cities, our factories, our people. If a 12-year-old boy can help us do that, then I'll move heaven and earth to support him." He shook Klaus's hand. a formal military handshake that acknowledged the boy as an equal, at least in this context. How many pilots do you think your system has kept alive? Klaus did the math in his head. If we had normal warning times, probably 3 or 4 would have been shot down or killed during takeoff attacks. Maybe more. Then you've already done more for Germany than most soldiers do in a lifetime. Galland headed for the door, then stopped. One more thing. Some people at headquarters think this whole thing is a hoax, that you're just getting lucky. Prove them wrong. Document everything. Make your methods teachable. And Klaus. Yes, sir. Don't get cocky. Pride kills more pilots than enemy fire. After Galland left, Schneider and Weber remained in the tower with Klaus. The boy was shaking, reaction to the tension finally hitting him. You impressed him, Weber said. That's not easy to do. I was terrified. Good, Schneider said. Fear keeps you sharp. Just remember, you're still a child. You don't have to carry the whole war on your shoulders. But in his heart, Klaus knew that's exactly what it felt like. The network grows. Within 3 weeks of Galland's visit, 5 listening posts were operational across the sector. Each was staffed by young radio operators, most barely older than Klaus, who'd shown aptitude for pattern recognition and electronics. Klaus trained them via telephone conferences and written protocols, developing a standardized methodology that could be taught and replicated. The system worked through triangulation and coordination. When Klaus detected suspicious radio activity, he would telephone the other posts. If multiple stations confirmed similar patterns from different locations, they could roughly calculate the bearing and size of incoming bomber formations. This information was fed to a central coordination center that Galland had established specifically for this purpose. Lieutenant Kaufmann proved invaluable. The technical officer had a gift for simplifying complex concepts and building equipment that was robust enough for military field use. He designed a standardized receiver package based on Klaus's modifications, with clear frequency markings and operation instructions. More importantly, he developed a visual classification system using color-coded charts that helped operators identify patterns even if they couldn't hear the subtle differences Klaus detected naturally. The first operational test of the network came on December 5, 1943. Klaus was at his post when he detected unusual radio activity at 1,347 hours. The patterns were different from normal, more scattered, suggesting multiple formations operating independently rather than as a single bomber stream. He immediately telephoned the other listening posts. This is Klaus. Station 2. Do you have unusual activity on frequencies 4.2 to 4.6? Confirming. Came the reply from Station 2, located 40 kilometers northeast. Strong interference patterns, bearing approximately 270 degrees. Station 3, to the southeast, reported similar activity but with a different bearing. Klaus quickly plotted the vectors on his map. His heart sank. Multiple formations, he announced to the network. At least 3 separate groups, possibly coordinated but approaching from different directions. This was new. The Americans and British were adapting their tactics, probably trying to overwhelm the defensive system by splitting their forces. Klaus had to make rapid decisions about which threats were most immediate and which squadrons should respond to which formations. He classified the threats. Formation Alpha, high confidence, approximately 50 aircraft, bearing toward Berlin. Formation Bravo, medium confidence, possibly 30 aircraft, bearing toward chemical works at Luna. Formation Charlie, low confidence, small group, uncertain target. Klaus made his calls. JG-52 would scramble for Formation Alpha. He telephoned neighboring squadrons about the other threats. The network was being tested to its limits. In the operations room, Major Dietrich coordinated the defensive response based on Klaus's information. Fighters from 3 different airfields took off in staggered launches. The squadron commanders, initially skeptical about taking orders ultimately derived from a child's observations, had learned to trust the system. The intercepts were successful, but revealed the system's limitations. Formation Alpha was engaged exactly where Klaus predicted, and heavy damage was inflicted on the bomber stream. Formation Bravo was also intercepted, though less successfully due to fighter shortage. Formation Charlie turned out to be a feint, a small group of mosquitoes on a weather reconnaissance mission. After the battle, Galland personally telephoned Klaus's tower. "Your network worked, but we were stretched thin. The enemy is adapting. We need to adapt faster." "I know, sir," Klaus replied, exhaustion clear in his voice. "They're splitting their formations now, trying to overwhelm us with multiple threats. Then we need to increase the network. Can we go to 10 stations?" Klaus considered. "Yes, sir, but coordination becomes harder. We need better communication infrastructure. Right now, I'm trying to call 5 different posts and collate information in real time while also running my own receiver. We need a proper coordination center with multiple telephone lines and map display." "You'll have it. I'm assigning additional staff to create what we're calling the Listening Service Coordination Center. You'll advise on the setup, but you won't run it day to day. You're a child, Klaus. You need rest. You need school." "School can wait, sir." "This can't." Galland's voice hardened. "That's not your decision, son. I've spoken with your father. You'll work 4-hour shifts, maximum. You'll have 3 days off per week for rest and education. This is non-negotiable." Klaus wanted to argue, but recognized the tone. This was a direct order from a general. "Yes, sir." "Good. Because if you burn yourself out, the entire system collapses. We need you sustainable, not sacrificed." The new coordination center opened in a converted hangar on December 20th. It was equipped with multiple telephone lines, large-scale maps, and staff trained in the Klaus system. Klaus worked as chief technical advisor, spending his shifts monitoring his receivers and training new operators while coordination staff handled the administrative work of managing the expanded network. The system's success created unexpected problems. Other Luftwaffe units wanted their own listening posts. Resources were stretched thin. Some commanders demanded Klaus personally train their operators, refusing to accept that standardized training protocols were just as effective. Political tensions emerged as various Luftwaffe administrative branches fought for control of the system. Galland fought these battles bureaucratically, protecting Klaus and the system's operational integrity. But even a general's authority had limits in the Byzantine politics of Nazi Germany's military hierarchy. On Christmas Eve, Klaus sat in his tower, no longer manning it full-time, but still his refuge, and watched snow fall across the airfield. His father joined him, carrying 2 cups of weak coffee, one of the few luxuries still available. "You look tired, Klaus." "I'm tired, father, but I can't stop. Every time I hear those patterns and warn our pilots, I think, maybe that warning will save someone's husband, someone's father. Maybe some child won't lose their parent like I lost mother." Ernst Schneider pulled his son close. "You can't save everyone. You know that, don't you? I have to try. Your mother would be proud of you. But she'd also want you to remain a child for as long as you can. This war has already stolen too much of her childhood." They sat in silence, watching the snow, while below them the coordination center continued its vigilant work. Somewhere over the North Sea, Allied bombers were forming up for another raid. And somewhere in the network of listening posts, young operators who Klaus had trained were already detecting the first signs, their radios crackling with the electronic harbingers of approaching death. The war would not stop for Christmas. Neither would Klaus's system. The price of success. The new year of 1944 began with intensified Allied bombing campaigns. The Americans had learned from their October losses and were now flying with massive fighter escorts. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs that could match or exceed the Bf-109's capabilities. The equation was changing, and not in Germany's favor. Klaus's network continued to provide valuable warning time, but success bred new problems. On January 11th, during a particularly complex raid involving multiple formations, Klaus detected something that made his blood run cold. One of his operators, stationed at Post 7, transmitted false information. The report claimed a large formation approaching from the northwest when Klaus's own receivers showed nothing. He cross-checked with other posts. All reported negative. But Post 7 insisted, and based on their report, a squadron of fighters scrambled into empty skies, wasting precious fuel and leaving other sectors vulnerable. After the confusion cleared, Hauptmann Schneider and Major Dietrich investigated. The operator at Post 7, Unteroffizier Braun, confessed under questioning. He'd fabricated the report because he wanted to prove his post was as capable as Klaus's original station. The desire for recognition had led to deception. Braun was court-martialed and transferred to a punishment unit. But the incident revealed a crucial flaw. The system depended on operator reliability and skill. Not everyone had Klaus's natural aptitude for pattern recognition. Some operators were adequate, others were barely competent. A few, like Braun, were actively dangerous. Galland ordered immediate reforms. Operators would work in pairs for verification. All reports required confirmation from at least 2 posts before fighters scrambled. Klaus was tasked with developing a competency test that would qualify operators before they joined the network. The test was rigorous. Klaus recorded actual bomber approach patterns and mixed them with atmospheric noise and false signals. Operators had to demonstrate they could reliably distinguish genuine threats from interference. Of the 30 operators tested, only 18 passed. The network shrank but became more reliable. Weber, who'd been promoted to Staffelkapitän, squadron captain, watched these developments with concern. One evening in late January, he found Klaus alone in the tower, staring at reports of a daylight raid that had devastated Hamburg despite early warning. "We gave them 20 minutes, Klaus said, his voice hollow. 20 minutes, and they still lost 12 fighters. The Americans came with so many escorts. It's not your fault, Klaus. Isn't it? I gave them advance warning. They scrambled, they engaged, and they died. Maybe if I'd been faster, more accurate." "Stop." Weber's voice was sharp. "This is war. People die, sometimes despite doing everything right. You've saved dozens of pilots. You can't save them all. Mother always said that anything worth doing is worth doing perfectly. Your mother was wrong about that. Perfection doesn't exist, especially not in war. Good enough to save lives is good enough." Klaus looked at him with eyes too old for a 12-year-old face. When does it stop being good enough? Weber had no answer. He'd been asking himself the same question for 4 years. The following week brought new intelligence that changed everything. A decoded intercept revealed that British intelligence was aware of the German listening posts. They knew the Luftwaffe was detecting their radio traffic. Allied bomber crews were being ordered to maintain stricter radio silence during approach. Klaus had predicted this. The advantage had always been temporary. But temporary had stretched to 3 months, far longer than anyone expected, because Allied command initially dismissed reports about the listening posts as impossible or exaggerated. Now that advantage was closing. Klaus noticed the change immediately. The radio patterns became less distinct, less frequent. His detection rate dropped from 90% to 70%, then to 60%. The system was still valuable, but no longer the miracle it had been. At a conference in February, Galland faced the reality squarely. "We've gotten 3 months of superior performance from the system. That's 3 months more than we had any right to expect. Klaus, you and your team have done Germany proud, but the enemy has adapted. The question now is, what do we do next?" Major Dietrich, who became one of Klaus's strongest advocates, spoke up. "The system still works better than standard radar coordination alone. The listening posts provide redundancy and sometimes catch raids that slip through radar coverage. I recommend we maintain the network, but lower our expectations." "Agreed," Galland said. "Klaus, I'm also pulling you back from active rotation. You'll continue in an advisory capacity, but you're spending too much time in that tower. You're 13 years old. You should be in school, not running military operations." "But, sir, that's an order, son. You've served Germany well. Now it's time to let others carry more of the burden." Klaus wanted to argue, but he recognized the exhaustion in his own body. He'd been running on adrenaline and duty for months. The nightmares had started, dreams of burning aircraft and screaming pilots, of bomber formations he'd failed to detect, of his mother's face in the flames of falling aircraft. His father noticed the signs too. Schneider requested and received a 3-week leave. and he took Klaus away from the airfield to stay with his sister in Bavaria, far from military operations. The break was supposed to be restorative. Instead, Klaus felt guilty for every hour he wasn't listening, every raid he didn't help intercept. He knew it was irrational. There were trained operators maintaining the network, but the sense of responsibility had become a weight he couldn't set down. On the last night before returning to duty, Klaus's aunt found him standing in the snow, looking north toward where he knew the war continued without pause. "Your father tells me you've saved many lives," she said quietly. "Not enough. How many would be enough, Klaus? How many before you can forgive yourself for being a child who couldn't stop a war?" The question cut through his defenses. Klaus started crying, the first real tears since his mother's death. His aunt held him while he sobbed out the months of accumulated trauma, fear, and impossible responsibility. When he returned to Jüterbog, Klaus was different, more settled, perhaps, but also more aware of the war's trajectory. Germany was losing. The listening posts helped, but there were tactical advantages in a strategic defeat. The question was no longer whether Germany would lose, but how many people would die before it ended. Klaus resolved to keep working for as long as he could help. Not because he believed in ultimate victory, but because every pilot saved was someone's father, someone's son, someone who deserved a chance to survive. The system under siege. Spring 1944 brought two major developments that tested Klaus's system to its breaking point. First, the Allies launched Operation Point Blank, an intensified strategic bombing campaign targeting German aircraft production. Second, and more ominously, German intelligence detected that the Allies were deploying specialized electronic warfare aircraft designed specifically to counter systems like Klaus's listening posts. The British Lancaster bombers now flew with accompanying aircraft that transmitted false radio signals, creating phantom formations that mimicked the patterns Klaus had taught his operators to recognize. American formations used frequency hopping techniques that made consistent pattern recognition nearly impossible. The radio spectrum became a battlefield of deception and counter-deception. Klaus sat in the coordination center. He no longer used his tower regularly, though it remained standing as a symbol, and studied the new challenges. His receivers picked up signals, but distinguishing genuine bomber formations from electronic spoofing required skills beyond pattern recognition. It required understanding the psychology of Allied radio operators, the timing of genuine communications versus scripted deceptions. "We need to go deeper," Klaus announced at a strategy meeting with Kaufman and the senior operators. "We've been listening to what they say. Now we need to listen to how they say it." "Explain," Kaufman prompted. Klaus pulled out recordings he'd been studying. Real radio operators have habits. They click the microphone differently. They have timing patterns in their transmissions. Some pause before speaking, others start immediately. These habits are unconscious and hard to fake. The spoofing aircraft transmit clean, professional, scripted messages. But real bomber crews, especially under stress, are messy. It was psychological profiling applied to radio intercepts, a concept that wouldn't have formal names or doctrines for decades, but which Klaus intuited from months of careful listening. He began training operators not just to hear signals, but to analyze the human patterns behind them. The new methodology showed promise. Detection rates stabilized around 70%. Not as good as the early days, but still significantly better than standard radar alone. More importantly, false alarm rates dropped dramatically. When Klaus's network called a genuine threat, commanders could trust it. But the improvements came at a cost. The psychological toll on operators increased. Listening for minute details in radio transmissions while knowing that errors could cost lives created intense stress. 2 operators suffered nervous breakdowns and had to be replaced. Another began making increasingly erratic predictions and had to be removed from service. Klaus felt the pressure acutely. He was 13 now, but felt decades older. His father noticed gray hairs beginning to appear in Klaus's dark hair. Stress manifesting in physical changes no child should experience. On March 6, 1944, the system faced its greatest test. Klaus detected a massive raid forming. perhaps the largest he'd ever seen. The radio patterns were overwhelming, suggesting 300 or more bombers with heavy fighter escort. He initiated maximum alert across the entire network. But something felt wrong. The patterns were too clean, too obvious, almost as if they wanted to be detected. Klaus hesitated, his finger over the telephone to call Gallen's headquarters. If he was right about the raid size, every available fighter needed to scramble immediately. But if this was an elaborate feint designed to pull German fighters to the wrong location, what are you waiting for? Major Dietrich demanded, seeing Klaus frozen. Sound the alarm. Something's wrong, sir. These patterns, they're too perfect, too obvious. We don't have time for philosophy, Klaus. Sound the alarm. Klaus made a decision that would haunt him. I'm calling this medium confidence, sir. Possible major raid, but I cannot confirm. Recommend alert status, but not full scramble. Dietrich overruled him. Based on the signal strength alone, he ordered full scramble. Fighters from 6 different squadrons took to the air, representing nearly 1/3 of available fighter strength in the region. Klaus continued monitoring his receivers, a sick feeling growing in his stomach. Then he heard it. Faint transmissions from a different frequency range, transmissions he almost missed in the noise of the massive fake raid signals. A smaller force, perhaps 50 bombers, approaching from a completely different direction. Sir, Klaus shouted, the main raid is a feint. Real attack coming from the southeast, bearing 130. Dietrich paled. Most of the fighters were already committed to intercepting the phantom raid. Only 2 squadrons remained to face the real threat. One of them JG-52, Klaus's father's unit. Hauptmann Schneider led his fighters toward the actual bomber formation with grim determination. They were outnumbered 3-1, and the bombers had time to reach their targets, the synthetic oil refineries at Luna, before adequate interception could be organized. Klaus listened to the battle unfold over the radio, his hands clenched into fists. His father's voice, calm and professional, directing his pilots. Weber's voice calling out targets. And then the sound that Klaus had learned to dread, the distress calls. Blue 3 is hit. I'm going down. Bandits on my tail. I can't shake them. My engine's on fire. The battle lasted 18 minutes. When it ended, the Luna refineries were damaged, but not destroyed. Enough German fighters had engaged to disrupt the bombing patterns. But the cost was terrible. 7 Bf-109s were shot down. 5 pilots killed, 2 wounded. One of the dead was Weber. Klaus heard his father's voice transmit the news, flat and emotionless in the way of men delivering unbearable information. This is group leader. Blue 2 is confirmed down. No parachute observed. I repeat, Blue 2 is down. The coordination center fell silent. Everyone knew Blue 2 was Staffel-Captain Weber, one of the squadron's most experienced pilots, Klaus's mentor and friend. The man who'd first believed in a 12-year-old boy's crazy system. Klaus stood slowly, walked out of the coordination center, and vomited in the snow. That evening, Galland arrived personally. He found Klaus in his tower, which the boy had retreated to despite no longer using it operationally. The general climbed the stairs without speaking, entered the small room, and sat beside Klaus. He believed in you, Galland said finally. I killed him. I hesitated. I doubted the patterns. If I'd called it correctly, if you'd called it as you saw it, we'd have scrambled to face a false raid while the real attack hit undefended targets. You were right to hesitate. Dietrich was wrong to overrule you. And Weber. Galland paused. Weber died, doing his duty, protecting Germany. His death is not on your conscience. Then why does it feel like it is? Because you're human. Because you cared about him. Because this war makes us all carry burdens we shouldn't have to bear. Galland stood. The enemy adapted their tactics specifically to exploit your system. They fed us information they knew we'd detect, then hit us from a different direction. It was sophisticated, well-planned, and it worked. That's on me and Allied intelligence, not on you. Klaus looked up. Will the system still work? We'll find out. But Klaus, I need you to understand something. You're being withdrawn from active status. What? No. Sir, I can adapt. I can learn their new tactics. You're 13 years old, and you just lost someone you cared about because of decisions made using your information. This is breaking you, son. Your father sees it. I see it. We're not throwing you away. You'll continue as a technical consultant, training others, developing new methodologies. But no more real-time operational decisions. That burden is too much. Klaus wanted to argue, but found he had no energy left. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a vast weariness that felt like it would never end. Chapter 8. The Final Warning. Summer 1944 marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, though many refused to see it. The Allies landed in Normandy. Soviet armies advanced from the east. The strategic situation was collapsing, and no amount of tactical innovation could change the fundamental reality. Germany was losing. Klaus continued working, but in a different capacity. He trained new operators, refined detection methodologies, and wrote training manuals that would outlive the war. His system had been formalized into doctrine, distributed to listening posts across what remained of German-controlled territory. The Klaus method, they called it in official documents, though Klaus himself found the fame uncomfortable and unwanted. The airfield at Jüterbog Dam saw fewer and fewer serviceable aircraft as the months progressed. Fuel shortages grounded fighters that would have flown. Pilot losses couldn't be replaced fast enough. Klaus's warnings were still valuable, but there were fewer fighters to scramble, and those that did take off faced increasingly overwhelming odds. On July 20th, 1944, everything changed. An attempt was made on Hitler's life, the Stauffenberg plot, and in the subsequent purge, thousands of officers suspected of disloyalty were arrested or executed. The paranoia reached even to fighter squadrons. Galland himself came under suspicion and had to fight to maintain his position. Klaus watched as the regime he'd been serving revealed its true nature. Officers he respected were dragged away by the Gestapo. Men who'd fought bravely for Germany were executed for the crime of wanting to end a losing war before Germany was completely destroyed. The boy who'd started this journey, believing in defending his homeland, began to understand the moral complexities he'd been too young to grasp initially. In September, his father sat him down in their quarters. Hauptmann Schneider looked older, worn by 4 years of war. "Klaus, I'm sending you away." "What?" "Father, no. Listen to me. The war is lost. I've known it for months, but now even the high command is beginning to understand. The Russians are approaching from the east, the Americans and British from the west. Germany will be occupied, probably divided. When that happens, there will be chaos. Then I should stay with you. You should survive. You should have a chance at a life after this madness ends." Schneider pulled out papers. "I've arranged for you to stay with your aunt in Bavaria. You'll go tomorrow. And you? I'll continue flying until the end. It's my duty." He gripped Klaus's shoulders. "You've done more than anyone had a right to ask of a child. You've saved lives. You've shown courage and intelligence beyond your years. But your war is over now. Let it end here, while you still have a chance to be something more than a casualty." Klaus wanted to argue, but he saw the determination in his father's eyes. This was a final order, given with a father's love rather than a commander's authority. The next morning, Klaus made one final visit to his tower. The listening post was still operational, manned by operators he'd trained, but it felt like visiting a monument to a different time. He'd spent his 13th year here, growing from child to something else, not quite adult, but no longer innocent. Below, on the airfield, the remaining Bf-109s sat in their revetments, battered and worn. Many would never fly again. Those that did would face enemies they couldn't hope to defeat. The war had moved beyond what individuals could affect, no matter how clever or brave. Klaus was packing his few belongings when the air raid sirens sounded. The familiar wail that he'd heard hundreds of times, but now with no fighters to scramble. The Americans were bombing in daylight with impunity now, their fighter escorts swatting aside the few German interceptors like flies. He ran to the tower despite knowing he should seek shelter. The operators were at their posts, dutifully tracking the incoming formation. Klaus grabbed headphones and listened. It was a massive raid, perhaps 200 bombers heading toward Berlin. The patterns were clear, the radio discipline perfect. Klaus could have predicted their route, their timing, their probable targets. But what would be the point? There were no fighters left to scramble. The listening post still heard the enemy, but Germany could no longer respond effectively to what they heard. Klaus stood at the tower window, watching the contrails appear on the horizon. Hundreds of aircraft, flying in formation, untouchable. The early warning system that had seemed so miraculous months ago was now just a way to know death was coming without being able to prevent it. "Sir," one of the operators said. They still called him sir despite his age. "Shouldn't you be in a shelter?" "Probably," Klaus replied. But he stayed, watching as the bomber formation passed overhead, heading toward the capital. Somewhere in those aircraft were young men, not much older than him, doing their duty as they saw it. Just as he'd done his duty, just as Weber had, until he died in flames over Luna. The bombers disappeared toward the north. Klaus finally left the tower and found his father waiting at the base of the stairs. "Your train leaves in 2 hours," Schneider said. "Say your goodbyes." Klaus walked across the airfield one last time. He visited the mechanics who'd helped him scavenge parts. He stopped by the coordination center where operators continued their vigil. He stood for a moment by the dispersal area where Weber's fighter had once been parked before that awful day in March. At the train station, his father embraced him tightly. "I'm proud of you, Klaus. Your mother would have been proud, too. You tried to save lives in a war that destroyed them. That's all anyone can do. Will I see you again?" Schneider hesitated, then chose honesty over false comfort. "I don't know. If Germany survives this with anything intact, perhaps. If not," he didn't finish the sentence. The train pulled away, carrying Klaus toward Bavaria and relative safety. He watched the airfield disappear in the distance, then closed his eyes and tried to sleep. In his dreams, he still heard the radio frequencies crackling with warning, still saw the colored lights of his signal system, still heard Weber's voice calm and confident over the radio. Hauptmann Ernst Schneider flew until the end. He survived the war by 3 weeks, dying not in combat, but in a senseless accident when a half-starved refugee crowd stampeded near Berlin, crushing him against a broken wall. Klaus learned of his death months later, through a letter from a surviving squadron member. The listening post continued operating until Germany surrendered in May 1945. The system Klaus had developed saved an estimated 200 Luftwaffe pilots over its 18 months of operation, men who would otherwise have been caught on the ground or scrambled too late to defend effectively. In the context of millions dead, it was a tiny number, but to those 200 men and their families, it was everything. After the war, Klaus completed his education and became an electronics engineer. He never spoke publicly about his role in the war until the 1980s, when historians researching Luftwaffe defensive systems discovered references to the Klaus method in captured documents. By then, he was an old man, ready to tell his story not as glorification, but as warning. "We convinced ourselves we were defending Germany," Klaus said in his only extended interview. And perhaps we were, but we were also defending a regime that was murdering millions. I was a child who wanted to save his father's friends. I didn't understand the larger context. That's my regret. Not that I failed to save more pilots, but that I didn't ask whether those pilots should be saved, given what they were fighting for. It was a question without easy answers, a moral complexity that Klaus carried for the rest of his life. He'd saved lives and served evil, both at the same time. The boy who'd built a crazy signal system had done something remarkable, but the man who looked back on that boy understood that remarkable doesn't always mean right. The tower at Jüterbog Dam survived the war. It stood abandoned for decades, until it was demolished in 1987 to make way for an industrial complex. No plaque marked its significance. Few remembered the boy who'd spent his 13th year there, listening to the radio frequencies and trying to give warning against the inevitable. But in military history, in the study of electronic warfare and early warning systems, Klaus Schneider's methods lived on, refined, improved, adapted for the jet age and beyond. The basic principle he discovered, that you could detect attacks by monitoring enemy communications patterns, became foundational to modern air defense. He wanted to save lives. In the end, he'd saved some and lost some, in a war that should never have been fought. That was Klaus Schneider's story, a boy who tried to make a difference, who succeeded in small ways while the world burned around him, and who spent the rest of his life wondering if he'd done the right thing. The question haunts us still.